What is enlightenment? How do you define that era of rational thinking that gave birth to the so-called modern world? In 1784, in the essay answering the question, "What is enlightenment?", the philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore saper aude, have courage to use your own understanding." Since then, the idea of the Enlightenment has gone through many incarnations. In the 1960s, the historian Peter Gay interpreted the Enlightenment as a unified, coherent movement. But it's also been defined nationally, the British Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, etc., to give it coherence. And more recently, postmodern and post-colonial thinkers have attacked the idea of an enlightenment altogether, citing it as a Eurocentric concept that didn't really contribute to ideas like anti-imperialism, democracy, or feminism at all. It is this recent postmodern attack on the idea of an enlightenment that Jonathan Israel, in his book Radical Enlightenment, attempts to defend the Enlightenment against. Instead of a single coherent movement, Israel thinks the Enlightenment is better seen through the categories of moderate and radical thinkers. While the moderates, thinkers like Hume and Locke, attempted to reconcile the idea of reason and emancipation with the old pillars of scripture and hierarchy, including colonialism and slavery, the radical Enlightenment thinkers rejected all compromise with the past and sought to sweep away existing structures entirely, while scorning all forms of ecclesiastical authority and refusing to accept that there is any God-ordained social hierarchy, concentration of privilege or land ownership in noble hands, or religious sanction for monarchy. The radicals, thinkers like Spinoza, Bayle and Diderot, had a reverence for mathematical logic, with some form of non-providential deism, if not outright materialism and atheism, along with unmistakably republican, even democratic tendencies. Israel's central claim is that despite not being widely known or highly regarded, it's Spinoza that should be the central figure of the Enlightenment. If radicalism was to spring from anywhere in the 17th century, Amsterdam was the most likely source. A Danish visitor to the city wrote in his diary that here are some atheists in Amsterdam, several of whom are Cartesians, among them a Jew who is an impudent atheist. That atheist, later described as a pantheist, was Baruch Spinoza, born in 1632 to a Jewish family of Portuguese immigrant ancestry, expelled from the synagogue in 1655 and taught, in his early development at least, by the prominent Amsterdam radical Van den Enden, from whom he would learn mathematics, some Greek, and most importantly, Cartesian philosophy. But what does Israel mean when he calls Spinoza a radical? And what was Spinoza's contribution to the legacy of the Enlightenment? If radical is defined as a break from the past, Spinoza's radicalism can be assessed through two tenets. First, he read Descartes, the thinker who kick-started the modern era of philosophy by describing the certainty of individual thought. But Descartes still argued that the mind was a separate entity from the body, in order that the mind or soul would have the possibility of leaving the body after death. Spinoza was one of the first philosophers to deny this Cartesian dualism, and so was a monist. And the second tenet, interconnectedly, he was the first to critique the Bible in such a rigorous and methodological manner. Pierre Bayle's later description of Spinoza as the greatest atheist there ever was highlights the opposition his work would come up against at a time when atheists could never be considered as virtuous. Spinoza was of course aware of the challenge his ideas would present to the theologized and, to his view, oppressed minds of the period, and the trajectory of his work from the softened approach of the theological political treatise to the more austere materialism of ethics is illustrative of the nuance Spinoza was capable of. A rejection of a literal reading of scripture and strict religious orthodoxy was first to be found in the theological political treatise, and Spinoza's ideas of freedom and conscience were criticised for their potential for leading to anarchy. But if moral relativity is what his critics feared, if downright immorality, it is exactly what they found 7 years later when Ethics was published posthumously. In Ethics, Spinoza makes his moral relativity explicit when he defines good as that which we certainly know to be useful to us, and bad as that which we certainly know to be an obstacle to our attainment of some good. But while this may have given his contemporaries cause for concern, his central point, in contrast to the social contractarians of the time, was a hopeful one. Nothing is more advantageous to man than man. And it's from these fundamental observations that monism means that we are all connected and that man is the sole measure of morality, that we see some of the most liberal and democratic writings of the period. Because while Cartesian dualism, the distinction between mind and body, had the purpose of bestowing on the mind the potential for immortality, Spinoza's monism inevitably led to a rejection of any supernatural belief. And from this, from Israel at least, materialism meant the undesirability of hierarchical systems, preordained by an immaterial God. It was this the Dutch preacher Johannes Alstius wrote in 1705 that unforgivably overturned the entire structure of divinely ordained morality. In fact, Israel defines the late 17th and early 18th centuries as a period when almost all great thinkers aimed to accommodate their thoughts with the Cartesian split, allowing them to line scientific and Enlightenment advances up with Cartesian beliefs and therefore uphold theology. Spinoza refused to do this, and because of this, reading his work written in the 17th century, is like reading something that could have been published yesterday. It's his focus on definitions and semantics that highlights the importance of language in philosophy, and inevitably leads to the linguistic turn of the 20th century. Spinoza's novelty and subsequent powerful influence is not just obvious, it's explicit. Hegel declared that it was either Spinozism or no philosophy at all. Nietzsche took up Spinoza's mantle of moral relativism, and Marx and Engels both read Spinoza for his determinism and materialism, a precondition of their own writings. And in the Bible of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, Russell writes that Spinoza is the noblest and most lovable of all the great philosophers. Intellectually, some others have surpassed him, but ethically, he is supreme. I'm going to put a recommended reading list for Spinoza and Jonathan Israel in the description below, and if you buy through those links, I'll get a small commission which would really help this channel out. You can subscribe to Then and Now by clicking here, and please like and share this video below. And if you're feeling really generous, you can pledge as little as $1 towards each new video on Patreon by clicking here.